Yeah.
Meeting to order. I call upon our acting secretary, Mr. Surya Narayana, to start the meeting with our FOSWL conventional prayer regarded by Rabindranath Tagore. Over to Surya Narayana for prayer, please.
Thank you, Samagaru. Heaven of freedom, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where the knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where the words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever widening thought and action. Into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I take the opportunity of welcoming all the participants and our members of our FOSWL, stands for Friends on Same Wavelength, Chennai Anna Nagar chapter, for our 164th meet. That is, we have completed 13 years, 8 months from inception. And I invite my fellow FOSWLians, ICC Cupertino, FOSWL Hyderabad, Chennai Adayar branch, as well as my Vijayawada members, as well as my music group members, and as well as my Vavilala Union group and Evergreen Seniors group. And I take the pleasure of welcoming our distinguished speaker, Dr. Krishnan Chitturi. He is an LLM, Bombay, SJD, Harvard, and a very, very prominent lawyer and columnist. Is very, very popular in New York. Is very, if you could spare some time to address our today's meeting, and he has chosen a very good, the topic which is very interesting to all of us, the price of colonization. Let us all listen to him, and after his lecture, we will have a discussion wherein all the members can put up their questions, and he will be happy to answer to all of us. Now, I call our Joint Secretary, Anand Kumar, to introduce our distinguished speaker. Oh, Anand Kumar, please.
Dear FOSWLians, I feel extremely privileged to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Krishnan Chittur, who is a gold medalist in constitutional and Hindu laws from Bombay University. He also holds a doctorate in law from Harvard. He is a New York-based law practitioner focusing on consumer protection and class action suits. As a PDG of New York Rotary Club, he led an RA convention at Singapore last month end. As a columnist, he dispels anti-India bias in Western media. He resumed his interest in Hinduism and now is doing a course at Hindu University of America. In his today's lecture, he is going to enlighten us on British colonization and exploitation reflected in divide and rule, expropriatory taxation, destruction of Indian industry, orchestrating contempt for Hindu religion by misrepresentation of Hindu scriptures, etc. He will also cover growing Hindu phobia in today's Western world. Over to Dr. Krishnan. I am eager to listen to Dr. Krishnan, sir, as I was all ears from my college days to the legal luminaries like Nani Falkiwala, Arun Shauri, and in recent times to Harish Salve. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Anand Kumar. Now, over to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Chittur. Over to you, sir, for the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Sharma and Dr. Kumar. You used an interesting word, which I am not used to hearing in introduction. He said, enlighten. That I believe that is appropriate under the circumstances because I myself had to be enlightened. I grew up in Mumbai. I went to school in Mumbai. And it's only after I resumed my studies recently that I realized that a lot of the nonsense that I had learned in Mumbai in an English medium school had to be unlearned, and I had to be enlightened about the facts. Permit me to share my screen so we can go through this. I'm going to give you an overview. Every one of these points that I will mention can be subjects for multiple PhD theses. They're all very involved and deep subjects, but I just want to give you an overview to get a sense of how badly we've been nailed, how badly we have been plundered, and how much of the damage that they have done is still continuing. So let me start with the screen. Everybody see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Dr.
Yes,
Sharma?
we're able to see. Yes.
Okay. The when we I do
Please
not
put it in the
remember reading.
presentation mode. Please put it in the presentation mode so that the full screen can be seen.
Oh, okay.
It is in the edit mode. Please convert it to, there is a small little icon in the bottom on the right side. A screen icon is there. Yeah, on your presentation itself, in your laptop, in the PowerPoint, you see now it is coming. Correct.
We learned a lot of things in my school history, but the one thing we didn't learn was about the plunder and the extent of the plunder of India by the British. The situation is so bad. Take a look at this. This is what Will Durant said. I was filled with astonishment and indignation at the apparently conscious and deliberate bleeding of India by England throughout 150 years. I began to feel that I had come upon the greatest crime in all of history. Now, many of you may be familiar with Will Durant. And for those who are not, Will Durant is the preeminent historian of the last century. He and his wife came out with 11 volumes on the story of civilization written through over 40 years. An extremely credible source and a historian. Now, here is one very interesting fact. The book that you see here, The Case for India, by Will Durant, this book was actually written in 1930. For some reason or the other, this was suppressed. It came to light only in 2007, and it was eventually published by the Strand bookstall in Mumbai. I would strongly urge you to read this book. This is by an American. Will Durant was an American, and the appalling conditions that he saw in British India is recorded there. It's just phenomenal. Moving on, to give a brief background, which most of us would have difficulty even contemplating. Here's a fact. This is historically India, USA, and UK share of the world GDP. Look at where India was back 2,000 years ago. Okay. And it went through various periods. I'm not dwelling upon any of that because my concern is here. The yellow one, the yellow line is the one by Britain. That's when they took over India. And look at that. We came from here, from top, from 35%, we came down here. Okay, that is the extent of the loot by the British. And where did this come from? Here. Robert Clive said, when I think of the marvelous riches of that country and the comparatively small part which I took away, I am astonished at my own moderation. Such were the morals of the men who proposed to bring civilization to India. That's quoted in Will Durant. I think most people are familiar with Robert Clive. He's a scoundrel that basically started the East India Company plunder back in the 18th century. That mentality was reflected throughout. It was not isolated with Dr. Clive. Okay. Let me touch upon a few of the aspects by which this was done. Number one, expropriatory taxation. The government, this is a statement, a written statement by Sir William Hunter, who was a member of the Viceroy's Council in 1875. He said the government assessment does not leave enough food to the cultivator to support himself and his family throughout the year. The taxation was so high, 50% in the peace settlement states. There were different methods of taxation, and it was as arbitrary. For those of you who have seen the movie Lagan, the taxation was absolutely arbitrary, whatever they wanted. And here you see that let me show you a picture. These are lines, famine lines, people lining up. At no point did India have insufficient food production that the country had to go into a famine situation. There was enough of food production. Famines were manufactured. Here's a photograph. It shows people standing in line, and look at the size of the line. Okay. The other thing about the taxation was that it had to be paid irrespective of produce, whether your produce was good or it was bad. So if there was a shortage of rainfall, one year you had a drought, never mind, you still had to pay the British. Your taxes were due. This brings me to the second point, and that is, I believe the root cause, the quote unquote original sin, the English Education Act of 1835, Lord Macaulay. The purpose of this whole act was to create a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. So what do? Once the East India Company left after the 1857 War of Independence, the government had said, now we got to run this country. And we need to first create a class of persons, Englishmen who are Indian looking and Indian blood. So first thing you do is starve the education system, convert everything into English, which is what they did. They completely abolished the local Gurukula system, not just the entire education system in India, the existing local system completely abolished, banned the study of Sanskrit in school, and replaced it with the new education system based on the British curriculum. Incidentally, this is a book that I would strongly recommend. By Caste is Not Hindu by GSR Ananta, A.S. Raj, and P.K. Kokreja. It's a recent book. These are three Malaysians who are also Hindus, who have written this eminently readable book, a rather short book. It's about the size of a Perry Mason, and that's got very valuable information. So once you abolish the Gurukula system, once you abolish the local system, once you impose taxation that is driving people into poverty, then what happens? There are no opportunities for people. So people have to take what is fed to them. And the only way to get ahead was to go to English medium schools, learn English, and hopefully get a job with the government. Okay. Now, let's focus on this for a minute. The English medium education was based upon textbooks that were created by Englishmen, written by Englishmen, reflecting the English view, the English perspective. That is the reason why those of us who are educated, I was educated, I went to school in Mumbai about 20 years after independence, but nevertheless, I learned a lot more about Lord Cornwallis and Lord Warren Hastings and the rest of the scoundrels than I did about Choran, Chelan, Pandyan, and other Indian kings. In fact, I recall the first time when I landed up in Tamil Nadu by myself. I must have been in my late teens. And when I saw the names of the State Transport Corporation, it used to be Cholan, Cheran, Pandyan, I couldn't connect at all. I said, where do these names come from? I had no clue that these were actually great empire. They were dynasties in Tamil Nadu. We were taught British history. We were taught the history as the British wanted us to know it. And this is 20 years after independence, the lingering effects. Okay. Moving on to the next point. Now, before that, let me make one more point. The English system was basically for creating clerks for running the government machinery, enforcing the government orders, etc., in the manner that the British wanted it to be enforced and effected. So Indians grew up, we became the backbone of the government. Okay. Which brings me to the next point, which is the entire British Empire was built on the backs of Indians. In the 19th century, $450 million for wars fought outside India, in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, all over the place. World War I, $1.2 billion India spent, 800,000 soldiers and 400,000 laborers. Okay. 64% of the total revenues of India went to this fratricidal army. Take a look at these photographs. This is soldiers, Indian soldiers, the Boer War, Indian soldiers in trenches in Europe. It's all over the world. India had nothing to do with any of these people. We had no beef with any of these people. Why were Indian soldiers being sent over there? Basically, to add Indian expense, incidentally. So we spend the money, we send these people for what? For protecting the British, for advancing British interests. Now, the worst of all, I think most of you would be familiar with this. Jallianwala Bagh massacre, April 13th, 1919. General Dyer called in the Sikh regiment to fire upon Sikhs, many of whom had gathered to celebrate the festival of Baisakhi. Some others were, of course, protesters, but whatever it was, he fired on an unarmed crowd and directed the fire at the thickest portion of the crowd. That, fortunately for us, that was a turning point in the thinking of most of our national leaders at that time. That was the time that even people like Gandhi started saying, we need self-rule, we need to get rid of the British. Until then, even if you see some of the notes and reports about Gandhi's struggles in South Africa, etc., you will find that he was actually fighting for, we are citizens of the empire. It was not a separate call for India, leave us alone, get out of our country. But it's this Jallianwala Bagh, a fratricidal massacre, that changed the whole tone. Let me move on to the next point. Now, perhaps many of you may recall that at one stage there was a commission sent by the British, I believe it was the Simon Commission, to see whether India was fit for home rule. And one of the major planks of support for this was a book written by one Miss Mayo. Mayo was a journalist from Pennsylvania, and she wrote a book concluding that Indians were unfit for home rule. And what all did she say? This was one of the major points she made. She said, Hindu mothers drug their children and keep them asleep for the whole day. Okay, can you trust these people to run a country? The fact of the matter, ladies and gentlemen, is that we have no idea of how really this took place. And here are the facts. All the drugs in India were grown by the British in land that was owned by the British. the British government, they control the wholesalers, they control the retailers. They set up 7,000 retail shops all over the country to sell marijuana. Okay. And because of the increasing poverty, women had no choice but to go to work. Now, if a woman has an infant and has to go to work, they are left with no choice but to say, keep the kid asleep with drugs. In some places, like for example, in Assam, Gandhi and many of the local activists, the churches, the religious entities there, as they lobbied, they agitated, they protested for a ban on drugs. The British government threw them in jail. They didn't stop the drugs. Okay. Here's the next point. Destroying Indian industry to advance British interests. India, as you probably know, is a very major cotton and silk producer. Well, the British were also into the textile industry and they wanted no competition. So guess what they did? They wanted Indians as suppliers. So the industrial production was squelched with taxation. There was an excise tax, taxes all the way. There was an excise tax on manufacture. The import tariff into England was 80%. So obviously, these skilled artisans, weavers, textile industry workers were all thrown out of work. So they started living off the land. Okay, take a look at this. This is just one figure. You probably have heard about the figure 45 million that was put by, that was calculated by Dr. Utsa Patnaik of Columbia University. Said $45 trillion was what was extracted by the British, plundered by the British in India, from India, from 1765 until 1930. That doesn't tell you the whole story. But let me nevertheless mention a little bit about that. The staggering heights from exports was 45 trillion. Now, here's how they did it in two ways. Number one, they collected taxes and then they used about one third of the taxes to buy goods for British use. So I'm taking money from you and then I'm giving it back to you saying, okay, now I'm going to take this much away from you. They bought the goods and took it to England, selling it at a profit. They re-exported the goods to other countries for significant markups. None of that found its way back into India where the goods were produced originally. After that, they found an easier way. They said, we don't need to get involved in this. We let the Indians do the export. Except that everything had to be channeled through London, special council bills. So Indians wanted to export. Yeah, you can export, for example, you can export to France, but the payment will be in London through special council bills. And London and special council bills could be bought only with gold or silver. So no matter what the Indian merchants sold where, London got its share of gold and silver. Now imagine the remaining amount of damage. This is just 45 trillion is just from this one area. Okay, it's not it's not the rest of it. It is the whole. This is just one small, tiny little portion. Okay. Let me move on to to a damage that is both soft and hard, and that is continuing to haunt us even today. And that is imposing the caste system in furtherance of their policy of divide and rule. Okay. Caste was unknown to India prior to the British. That whole system, Systema de Casta, is a system that was imported from medieval Europe. The Portuguese and Spanish, they used that system. This system imposed a certain hierarchy based on bloodlines. Now, when the British came to India, they found, see, Hindu society is not structured uniformly. It is, in one sense, it is completely organic in the sense that it grew organically. That is why you do not find the same set of castes in Kashmir, for example, as you will find in Tamil Nadu, as you will find in Maharashtra. They grew organically. Okay. Now, I will get back to this a little later when I dwell on this a little more. But before, that's an involved topic. But before that, I'm just focusing now on one aspect of why they created this. It helped them divide and rule. Indians at that time, they just called themselves by whatever were typically their occupation. In fact, most of the castes you find are, Mahar and Kumar and Chamar and all that. They are all occupations. So it is an occupation-based nomenclature. It is only, as Wendy Donegar comments, it's only after the British began to define communities by their religion, and foreigners in India tended to put people of different religions into different ideological boxes, did many Indians follow suit, ignoring the diversity of their own thoughts and asking themselves which of the boxes they belonged. Guys had never thought about what am I? All of a sudden, they get this census questionnaire in the, from the government. Now you got to answer it. Okay, there's a box in there that asks you to define yourself. I got to find a box. Where do I fit in? People don't know. So they landed up signing these boxes. That's how they fell into a certain caste. They defined themselves. Now, how did this help the British? When they brought in the electorate system, okay, for managing all the small time stuff that didn't bother the British. And of course, anything that they didn't like, they obviously vetoed that with their own legislative power. So they created and fostered separate electorates. I have specifically mentioned Sikhs because it's a particularly gross attempt. Not attempt, it's a particularly gross move. My friend Pratap Batra, who grew up in the Punjab, in the rural village in Punjab, back in the 40s, in the 30s and 40s, tells me that in his village, the Hindu and Sikh communities were like this. There was not a single, to quote Pratap, there was not a single Hindu family that didn't have a Sikh son-in-law or daughter-in-law, and vice versa. There was not a single Sikh family that didn't have a Hindu son-in-law or a daughter-in-law. So the communities were completely integrated. As Pratap put it, my mother used to go to the temple every day at 6 o'clock in the evening. And sometimes on the way, she would meet a Sikh friend, and they would go to the Gurudwara, or they would go to it didn't make any difference to them. That was the situation in the entire community, all over Punjab, between the Sikhs and the Hindus. But then the British created and fostered separate electorates. So now you had a Sikh electorate, and you have a Hindu electorate, and you had all kinds of other electorates based on religions and grouping that the British artificially designated. So at the end of the day, the voters voted not as citizens of India, but as members of a social or religious group that was designated by the British. And they manufactured these groups as they wanted. Okay? Take a look at this. One of the architects of the imposition of the caste system in India was this guy, Risley. Okay. The Hindu scriptures talk about varnas. There were 4 varnas, and I'll get to that in a minute. Riley proposed, why don't we create a 5th one? And then he conflated the varnas, the jatis, into the caste system. Okay. Now, his proposal, according to Risley's proposal, he called himself an anthropologist specializing in India. In his proposal, a lot of the castes in India really belong to the impure varna. Okay. There is no such thing in the Hindu texts. None. After that, this slide shows you the development. Then Gopal Krishna Gokhale developed the term depressed classes. Remember, these are all people who are being educated in English. Okay. Now, again, depressed classes, mission society was established. But again, no such thing as depressed classes exists in Hindu texts. In 1918, the Maharaja of Baroda uses the term untouchables. And that is the time. Maharaja of Baroda, as you probably know, was a financier for Dr. Ambedkar. All India Manifesto of Untouchability 1918, that is the time that they started the recognition to account and struggle to account for and uplift the depressed classes. In 31, Mahatma Gandhi resisted the term untouchable, started a new term. And there was a tussle between Dr. Ambedkar and Mahatma Gandhi. Ambedkar argued that untouchables are not Hindus. Gandhi disagreed. Okay. In 1935, for the first time, the government of India used the term scheduled caste. Okay. The term depressed classes was changed into scheduled castes. And Ambedkar bought wholesale into that. After that, in 1950, Gandhi was dead. Ambedkar became the chairman of the drafting committee of the Indian Constitution, and his personal grievance was cast in stone, and caste system became a part of the Indian Constitution of the Indian legal firmament. Okay, that's how caste system got completely institutionalized in India. A full-scale success for the British policy. And the amount of damage that the caste system has inflicted is just phenomenal. Even today, for that matter. See, there is always a tendency to group, a tendency to move towards hierarchies. But this caste system has been exploited by many of our politicians. I was just reading a book called Broken Promises. It's about Lalu Prasad plunder, Lalu Prasad Yadav's plunder of Bihar. Unbelievable. It's an exploitation of by Lalu of his caste, the Yadavs, against the Rajputs, the Bhumihars, the rest of the guys in Bihar. So it became that this was a very cogent ground for class conflict. Okay, they call it caste. I don't know what it is, but it is the seed for many a battle in India. Much of our politics is based on this nonsense. Okay, so let me go back now to where exactly this caste system came from. You may have heard of two different terms, jatis and varnas. And the problem is here, as a matter of fact, the jatis are completely opposite. They're the polar opposite of varnas. Okay. Jatis, as Will Durant correctly noted over 100 years ago, about 100 years ago. So jatis are really guilds. Bankers, merchants, manufacturers, farmers, engineers, track walkers, butchers, barbers, fishermen. They differ from our trade unions only in the loose expectation that sons will follow the trades of their fathers. Now, these jatis developed organically, individually. For example, in the eastern part of Maharashtra, there is what's called as the Bara Balutedar system. Bara Balutedar actually refers to 12 skilled artisans. So you have people like Kumar, they're the potters, the chamar, there's the cobblers, Mahar, they're the people who remove dead bodies and all that kind of stuff. People, occupational identification. Occupational identification. Now that is unique to Eastern Maharashtra. Will you find any of these mentioned in any of our scriptures? No, none of them is mentioned in the scriptures. But the British designated them as castes, and our friends in the government way back about 100 years ago, or maybe a little less than that, they designated that as a scheduled caste. And so it remains. Okay. Now, occupational hierarchy is nothing new. It's found in every single society. Take a look at this. Okay. Here. Back to occupational names, common, hierarchical, all over the world. Here, a Bacter, cattle thief. Okay, just go through the whole list, and this is actually fun if you Google it and take a look at all the names that come up. And you will find this occupational hierarchy very common. In Mumbai, for example, there was I recall a discussion about how, for example, the Parsis got their surnames. And they said the guy who was selling soda became soda wala. The guy who filled the soda bottles with water was soda water wala. The guy who was selling the openers for the bottles, soda water bottle opener wala, and on, based upon occupations. Okay. This is if you're talking about religion, and today in the West, Hinduism is conflated with casteism. What do our children here in high school learn? They learn that Hinduism is casteism. The Hindus have these 4 castes, and on it goes. Utter nonsense. This is what the Bhagavad Gita says. Chaturvarnyam maya srishtam guna karma vibhagashaha. Chaturvarnyam maya, these 4 varnas were created by me. And they are based on what? Guna, karma. They are based on character, qualities, and conduct. He does not say it is based on Vamsha and Kula. Okay, so this Varna system is completely different. Varna is a system of a social order. And in fact, Vivekananda once said, he said, the goal, the ideal in India is to convert everybody into a Brahmin, because a Brahman is the ultimate. Okay, look at this. This is from Skanda Purana. Janmana jayate Shudraha. Everybody is born a Shudra. Samskara dvija uchyate. Okay, through samskaras, purificatory process, one becomes a dvija, twice born. Vedapatat bhaved vipraha, brahma janati brahmanaha. So these are stages of learning, of enlightenment, of illumination, self-realization. Those are the 4 stages: Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra. So the Varna system was a self-organizing social system that naturally occurs in a community based on mental aptitude. Okay. But the British re-engineered on purpose to fit their systema casta, the system that the European countries and their monarchy practiced and imposed on the people on the basis of blood lineage. So you see that the Varna system is based on Varna is based on your character and conduct, and you go up the scale as per character and conduct. It is not a legally enforceable system. This is a social order that is prescribed. The Jatis, on the other hand, are basically occupations. What were you doing? And that was changeable, because if you had to change your Jati, you could quite simply move elsewhere, as happened in many cases. And there were other situations where that didn't happen. But then some amount of ossification, some amount of stratification occurs over a period of time, which is there in all societies. By the way, I must also add that I am by no means condoning all the atrocities that take place in the name of caste. The fact of the matter is, caste is not Hindu at all. So I'm not condoning any of those atrocities. I'm just pointing out that caste was not Hindu. Caste was something that is manufactured by the British and thrust on us. And that has been used by unscrupulous people all the time. Take a look at, you'll be stunned at how many castes there are in India today. Take a look. In 1881, there were 1,929 castes. So castes and subcastes. Now this includes the scheduled castes later on. it includes the scheduled castes, the other backward classes, all the rest of it, extremely backwards, Dalits, etc., etc. In 2011, those are the last figures available. There were 4.67 million castes. And the Registrar General of India flagged, these are incidentally official figures. The Registrar General of India flagged problems with the caste enumeration, saying different people understood different things when asked about caste. 330 million households cannot result in 4.6 million castes, with 72 households per caste. Okay. According to Hindu texts, there are always and only 4 varnas. Okay. The reason I dwell on this is because tremendous damage has been inflicted and continues to be inflicted. See, as I said, the British inflicted 2 types of damages. One is the hard damage, something that is tangible, that could be computed, that could be measured. But the soft damage that they inflicted began in 1835. That is what I call the original sin, propagating a completely perverted view of Hinduism. Hindus were presented to the rest of the world as following a religion that was a primitive monstrosity. They laughed at. Our children are embarrassed to call themselves Hindus. If you look at the social media notice posts, it's terrible. Okay, and where is that coming from? It is coming from the caste. Let me give you another example. This book, look at this, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. This is written by a woman, Isabel Wilkerson. Wilkerson was a reporter with the Times. Okay, she wrote this book. I read this book, and 2 things were, I was outraged, and 2 things are absolutely clear. This woman had no clue about what she was talking about. She didn't have a clue on what the caste system was. Okay, she nevertheless attributes the worst of the evils of the last few centuries, including slavery, including Nazism, to Hinduism. How do you like that? Hitler was a thoroughbred Catholic. He was an Austrian Catholic, but according to her, he learned it from the caste system in India. What is worse than that is that this book has won several prizes. It was in the New York Times nonfiction bestseller list for over 58 weeks. It was labeled, one critic labeled it as a book of the century. And that book has sold well over 500,000 copies. What does that tell you? That a lot of people still believe the garbage that's being portrayed here. History textbooks all over the place. In the high schools. Now, to summarize the economic effect of India during the last half of the 19th century, this is not even covering after that, okay? The heyday of the British intervention, income in India collapsed by half. Average life expectancy of Indians dropped by a fifth from 1870 to 1920. Tens of millions died needlessly of policy-induced famine. Dr. Jason Hickel, who is a professor at Oxford University, concluded, he said, we need to recognize that Britain retained control of India, not out of benevolence, but for the sake of plunder, and that Britain's industrial rise didn't emerge sui generis from the steam engine and strong institutions, as our school books would have it, but depended on violent theft from other lands and other people. Okay. The fact of the matter is, there is much in history that we are and have been unaware of. As once again, I'll just give 2 illustrations. One is this quotation from Voltaire. the French philosopher, said, I'm convinced that everything that has come down to us from the banks of the Ganges, astronomy, astrology, metempsychosis, etc. It's very important to note that some 2,500 years ago, at the least, Pythagoras went from Samos to the Ganges to learn geometry. That's Voltaire. Another example is Kautilya's Arthashastra that seems to be making a comeback these days. Many management schools are now presenting courses based upon Kautilya's Arthashastra. But here's a significant thing for present purposes. That in Arthashastra, for example, you have a provision dealing with the sale of gold jewelry in the highways. Pause and reflect on that for a minute. What does that tell you about the prosperity of the country at that time? You have laws concerning selling jewelry in the highways, like they are selling Mettur vadas and batata vadas in India. That was a level of prosperity. Okay, what happened? We don't know. We've been subject to a barrage of nonsense. There are very serious questions being raised that actually about this Aryan invasion, Aryan Dravidian divide. I'm not getting into that, but let's say for present purposes, there's a very strong body of evidence pointing to the fact that no such invasion ever took place. It was manufactured. But that's a subject for another day. Now, talking about the growing Hindu phobia. Hinduism, in my opinion, is not a religion. Religion was again superimposed upon the Hindus. It was organically grown way of life. That's why you find such a lot of diversity all over the country. Who founded Hinduism? No one. Is there a common set of beliefs like the Christians have 10 commandments? No, we don't. Hinduism includes atheism, polyism, polymorphism, Advaita, Dvaita, all kinds of beliefs. We never felt threatened by anybody. So you don't have a founder. You don't have one set of beliefs. Everybody was welcome. You walk into a Hindu temple today in the United States, in most of the Western countries, you will find deities of Mahavir and Gautam Buddha. We have no problems with any of them. Wendy Doniger quotes an evangelist publication of the 1700s, which says that these pilgrims who are going to Jagannath Puri, just have them believe, in addition to their gods, have them believe in that Christ is also one of their gods. So this was a great culture with a great background, as is clear from many of our sites, the architectural sites, the major temples, etc. That engineering is just unbelievable, and how they did it 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 years ago, no one knows. But right now we are facing a serious challenge of Hindu phobia. And I'll give you a couple of examples and then open up for questions. Several years ago, there was a gentleman a family that donated $3 million to the University of California in Irvine. That's a public university. As most of you may know, many of the universities in the United States basically have endowed chairs. Rich people endow a chair in memory of somebody or the other, a chair in a particular subject. So you have a chair for the genetics, chair for breast cancer, and on and on. This family wanted to endow a chair for Hindu studies. The university accepted it, and 3 months later, rejected that money, refunded it, and refused to establish a chair in Hindu studies because 1,900 people objected to a chair in Hindu studies. Number two, most people are not aware of this, but in the Columbia University, there was going to be established a chair, an endowment that was going to be the representative of the Shankaracharya of Sringeri, the Sringeri Mutt. And the person who was supposed to be heading that was a Marxist who thought nothing good of Hindu scriptures, of Hindu texts and Hindu practices. He believed that Sanskrit was the language of the oppressors. And ultimately, when Rajiv Malhotra somehow managed to get an audience with the Shankaracharya and inform him that this is what is happening, the Shankaracharya said he was not even aware that he was going to be represented by somebody who was his polar opposite, who didn't believe in Hinduism at all. The third thing that you find in terms of Hindu phobia is this growing militant movement for anti-caste legislation and beating up Indians with caste. As a matter of fact, it is completely unnecessary because in the United States, the laws typically ban discrimination on the basis of birth, national origin, etc. That ban is already there. But then you have to question, why do these people need another ground? Why do you need to include caste? Bogus studies, manufactured cases to beat up Hindus. So we today, given these facts, given the militant movement, and notice that this quote unquote oppressed class politics is getting internationalized. Kashmir is now part of the Gaza battle. And that in turn is part of the BLM, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Black movement, and on and on. And we are becoming a part of that one. We're being pulled into that. That is one thing that we need to guard against. And this constant drumbeat of casteism has got to be countered. Thank you. I'll now open for questions.
Okay, let me take this opportunity to thank you so much from the bottom of our hearts for enlightening us on this, very historical topic, where we need to be charged and understand what exactly was the position and what we should be doing as intellectuals and what we should be focusing on whenever there are fora to discuss these aspects. And we are very thankful and blessed to have a learned speaker like you, who has got an exposure to the various aspects of Hindu law as well as the situations, and as I can see, you have covered several areas and good reference books also I have given. Nice to have a very well-read speaker. Thank you very much from the FOSWL administrative team. My brother also joins me in the senior Sarmaji in thanking you on this occasion. And I also thank all the participants who have taken time to sit here and listen to this. And of course, our secretary, Surya Narayan Garu, for making the event happen and conducting it with the login and other things.